Hello, my name is Christy Baxter, and I'm the Assistant Director of Translational Research here at Genetic Alliance. The topic of today's webinar is the new NIH National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences, also known as NCATS. Today's webinar is part of a series for Genetics Day on the Hill, which will take place at the Reserve Officers Association on Thursday, June 23rd. We hope you all will be able to join us. For more information on how to join Genetics Day on the Hill, please visit our website at www.geneticalliance.org/geneticsday2011. Genetic Alliance will be discussing 3 topics at Genetics Day on the Hill, one of which is incentivizing translational research, particularly through the new NIH National Center for Accelerating Translational Sciences. Here to speak with us today is Dr. Kathy Hudson, the Deputy Director for Science, Outreach, and Policy at the National Institutes of Health. Dr. Hudson works with NIH leadership to develop and implement new strategic and scientific initiatives and is the NIH liaison with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Prior to becoming the NIH Deputy Director of Science, Outreach, and Policy, Dr. Hudson was the founder and director of the Genetics and Public Policy Center and an associate professor in the Berman Institute of Bioethics, Institute of Genetic Medicine, and the Department of Pediatrics at the Johns Hopkins University. Before her position at Johns Hopkins, Dr. Hudson served as the Assistant Director of the National Human Genome Research Institute, where she provided public policy focus and leadership for the NHGRI programs, including the Human Genome Project. Dr. Hudson holds a PhD in molecular biology from the University of California, Berkeley. Welcome, Dr. Hudson, and thank you for finding time to speak with us today about this exciting new development at the NIH.
Thank you, Christy, for inviting me. I'm happy to have an opportunity to talk about the new National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences. We have been focusing on how we can use NIH's investments to spur innovation and to speed the discovery of new treatments and therapies. In the President's budget for next year, for 2012, there were a number of priorities put forward for the National Institutes of Health, and one of those is Advancing Translational Sciences, and that's what I will talk about today. So, of course, the NIH has a long history in being involved in therapeutics and diagnostics development. In fact, there was a recent article in the New England Journal of Medicine that documented the important contribution that publicly supported research institutions have made in the development of important drugs and therapeutics. And we want to continue that tradition, but of course there is this dilemma in the long road between a laboratory-based discovery and having a new medicine in our medicine cabinets, and that's frequently referred to as the valley of death, where there is a very high failure rate of trying to get new medicines into our medicine cabinets. It's very expensive, and it's a very, very lengthy process. This slide shows the number of new medicines that have been approved by the FDA by year, and you can see that last year, in 2010, only 21 new medicines were approved by the Food and Drug Administration. And this is despite the significant investment both of the National Institutes of Health and, importantly, of the pharmaceutical industry that are all focused on developing new therapies. And so the question is, can we increase the throughput of the therapeutics pipeline? Can we get more medicines into our medicine cabinets for those many, many diseases and disorders for which there is no effective intervention available? This slide shows how innovation has been relatively flat in the drug development space. So what this slide shows is for 3 companies, the cumulative number of new drugs, new molecular entities, or NMEs, that have been approved by the FDA. So it's just additive every year. So it starts in 1950 with very few, and then every year adding on the new molecular entities that have been approved. And what you would expect is that this line would curve up if there was a big innovation that caused a big jump up in the number of new drugs approved by the Food and Drug Administration. So during the time that's covered by this chart, we've seen the discovery of the structure of DNA. We've seen massive advances in chemistry and pharmacology. We've seen the development of recombinant DNA, and yet despite all of those technological advances, this line has remained very straight through time. And so what we really want to do is figure out how to introduce new innovations that will bend this line. This is another way of looking at the same problem, which shows that for every 10,000 compounds that enter the drug development pipeline, or funnel in this case, only one ends up being approved after about 14 years and a couple $1 billion of investment. So at each stage along the way, many compounds drop out, and expenses go up as you move through this funnel to ultimately having an FDA-approved drug. And of course, even after you have an FDA-approved drug, there's still enormous amounts of work that need to be done in order to get that new therapy adopted by the health professional community and in order to get it used effectively by patients. So this shows just one part of that therapeutics pipeline, but it actually extends until effective implementation and adoption of those new interventions. So the mission for our new proposed Center for Advancing Translational Sciences is to catalyze the generation of innovative methods and technologies that will enhance the development, testing, and implementation of diagnostics and therapeutics across a wide range of human diseases and conditions. So NCATS is entering the scene at an interesting point in time. We have had a deluge of new discoveries, many of them from molecular biology and the Genome Project. So we now have lots of genome-wide association studies that have identified potential targets for new therapies. We have many medical conditions for which there is no effective intervention, and this is especially true for rare and neglected diseases where there's not a significant market that would cause the private sector to invest in that arena. And because of the long time period and high cost of getting therapies through the pipeline, we feel that it's time to look at the pipeline as an engineering problem, to look at the failure rate and the expense and the time as a scientific problem that could be ripe for experimentation and re-engineering. So we want to develop these processes that will speed the entire therapeutics development process. So we want to innovate along the pipeline in an open access way, in a pre-competitive way, in order to develop new ways of taking drugs from early target identification all the way through FDA approval and into widespread use. So NCATS will provide new tools and methods. We will collaborate with researchers both inside NIH and also in the private sector. We want to facilitate partnerships and collaborations across all sectors, and we want to enhance training in disciplines that are relevant to translational sciences, particularly, for example, pharmacology. So this slide shows the therapeutics development pipeline from disease and target identification all the way through post-FDA approval work. And what NCATS is doing right now is trying to identify where along this pipeline are there particular points where people who are involved in therapeutics development are running into costly barriers that are slowing their work. And so we have undertaken an extensive consultation process in order to hear from the biotechnology industry, from the pharmaceutical industry, from patient advocacy groups, from academic scientists, and from our colleagues in the Food and Drug Administration about what are areas along this pipeline that would be ripe for our attention. And these are some of the ideas that we've already heard from folks, and we are continue to be in this consultative pose in order to get all the input that we will need ultimately to develop the strategic plan and priorities for the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences. So I'll give you a couple of examples of some of these priority areas or potential priority areas. So along this pathway, before scientists can test the safety and efficacy of new compounds or new biologics in human beings, there has to be some assessment of the toxicity of those compounds. And the method for doing toxicity testing is largely testing those compounds for toxicity in animal models of one sort or another. And in fact, FDA requires that you present toxicity data to them in order to approve first-in-man use of new drugs and biologics. And yet the way in which toxicity testing is done is not very predictive of what's going to happen when you put a new drug into human beings. So this slide shows the relationship between animal toxicity testing and what happens when you actually put a compound into a human being. And I'll specifically point out the hepatic line here, bar in the graph, which is liver toxicity. And you can see that for compounds that were demonstrated to not have toxicity in animals, 50% of them showed toxicity when put into human beings. So this is not a particularly strong correlation, and the question is, are there other ways in which we could test toxicity before going into humans that would give us a better idea of what will be safe, and do that hopefully at a lower cost than what is very expensive and time-consuming to do animal testing. Another example, or one possible way of exploring toxicity testing is potentially to use induced pluripotent stem cells as models of human organ systems. So you can imagine taking particular cells and making them into pluripotent stem cells and then differentiating them into liver cells, for example, and being able to use those liver cells to test the toxicity, the liver toxicity of specific compounds in a high throughput way before trying them in human beings. Another example of potential constriction points along this pipeline is what happens in the clinical trials process and in the FDA review process. There's all sorts of opportunities for looking at new models of doing clinical trials and of new ways of getting informed consent, new ways of recruiting patients into clinical studies. And in thinking through all of these new possibilities, NIH has been working very closely with the Food and Drug Administration, both on a number of areas where we can work together, but specifically on regulatory science, where we have jointly awarded grants that are looking specifically at how can we bring new evidence to the regulatory enterprise that can speed the review and of new medicines. We have formed a joint leadership council between Peggy Hamburg and Francis Collins, whose goal is to advance translational science, and that leadership council has been working hard. There are a number of working groups that have been formed that are looking at specific areas of collaboration, and I think they're listed in this slide. Yeah, the specific working groups are working on bioinformatics, drug rescue and repurposing, new models for clinical trials, and preclinical research, including the area I talked about, how to modernize toxicology and other related technologies. So I want to say just a word about one of those areas, which is rescue and repurposing. We know that many drugs don't make it through the pathway into FDA approval, and that can be because they end up showing a lack of efficacy. That can be because they turn out to be toxic, and they end up being abandoned, sometimes left in left in the freezers and cabinets in pharmaceutical companies. There's also examples of where an FDA-approved drug for a specific indication can also have value for other indications, what's called repurposing. And NIH sponsored a meeting to discuss how we might be able to more effectively look at rescue and repurposing, and that included representatives from the Food and Drug Administration, from many biotech and pharmaceutical companies, our friends in the academic sector, and patient advocacy groups. And the intention of this meeting is not that the NIH or NCATS will get into the business of doing rescuing and repurposing, but rather that we can develop models for how that could be done, develop resources for how companies can make available abandoned compounds that might be amenable to other people, other entities to do research on to find other possible uses for them. So the NCATS will facilitate but not duplicate the translational research that's going on in the other NIH institutes and centers. Rather, we will work closely with the other institutes and centers to enable their work to be even more effective and have a higher impact. This slide shows the amount of translational research that's going on across all of the NIH institutes and centers. As of last year, several $1 billion of investment in translational research and therapeutics development, largely in drugs, but also in vaccines, biologics, and devices. And so that work will continue to go on, and NCATS will serve as a source of information, collaboration, and the source of new approaches to translational sciences and therapeutics development. So this is a representation of all of the NIH institutes and centers, and NCATS will be the newest entry into this family and will serve as a coordinating force for translational sciences at the NIH. Early on, when the proposal for NCATS was put out there was some confusion about what exactly NCATS would do in the therapeutics development space, and how would that relate to what's being done by our colleagues in the private sector. And there was some confusion about whether NIH was trying to develop its own little pharmaceutical company, and it's taken some time for us to be clear and communicate to the private sector, who now understand and support what we're doing, that we're not going to be doing drug development, but rather we're going to be trying to create new methods and approaches that can be adopted by everybody who's doing drug development, whether that be new methods of target validation or standards for sample preparation for biorepositories, or new models for doing clinical trials. Those are the kinds of outputs that NCATS will have. It won't be, we will not measure success in terms of new drug approvals. So we hope that NCATS will collaborate and partner with the academic sector, with advocacy groups such as yours, nonprofits, the Food and Drug Administration, importantly, pharma and biotech. And we're starting to build those partnerships even now as we plan for the establishment of the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences in October. Last, NCATS will reinforce and not reduce NIH's commitment to basic biomedical research. Our investment in basic biomedical research has been fairly constant over time, ranging around 52-53% of our total budget. And that will remain the same. We have a strong commitment to basic biomedical research and discovery, and that's really the engine that fuels the rest of the pipeline, if you will. And so that will not be altered by the creation of the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences. So it will have, there was some concern early on among some academics that the creation of the center might make it even harder for them to get their R01s supported by the NIH, and that won't be, NCATS will not be a factor in that at all. So in creating NCATS, we are taking a number of programs that already exist at the National Institutes of Health and moving them in together. We are moving in components of the Molecular Libraries program, a program called Therapeutics for Rare and Neglected Diseases. Both of those programs are currently at the National Human Genome Research Institute. In the Office of the Director is the Office of Rare Diseases Research, which is headed by Steve Groff. I'm sure many of you know him. And that office will be moved into NCATS. A program called Rapid Access to Interventional Development will go into NCATS. The Clinical and Translational Science Awards, which is a large, about $500 million a year program currently at the National Center for Research Resources, will move in. The CTSAs currently are comprised of 60 institutions across the country that are supporting innovative translational work and supporting infrastructure for clinical and translational science. The Regulatory Science Program, which I mentioned briefly, that's a collaboration between us and FDA, will move in. And then one new program will move into NCATS, and this is the Cures Acceleration Network. And this was proposed for $100 million in FY 2012 in the President's budget. So the Cures Acceleration Network was an authorization that was included in the Affordable Care Act, and it is specifically intended to advance the development of, quote, high-need cures and reduce the barrier between research discovery and clinical trials. In other words, being able to bridge that valley of death that we've been talking about. It has a novel board of directors that is advisory to the NIH, and that board is comprised of, I think, 24 people, including patient advocates, including private sector folks, and including people from the venture capital sector. The interesting, one of the most interesting aspects of the Cures Acceleration Network are these three new authorities that are provided to the NIH. The first is the authority to award very large grants, up to $15 million per award per year. The second is the ability to have partnership awards, or to have basically a matching grant, so that we can leverage the interest of others in making awards together. And lastly, the Flexible Research Authority, which is a DARPA-like authority that allows us to be very nimble in starting projects, and also to be able to stop projects if they're not meeting their benchmarks or milestones. So these are really fabulous new authorities to have for NCATS, and we're excited to be able to put those into place. This is a organizational chart of NCATS, and it looks like sort of a garden variety NIH institute, but it differs in a couple of important respects. And specifically at the bottom, you see two divisions, the Division of Preclinical Innovation and the Division of Clinical Innovation. And so rather than having the first separation within the institute being the difference between intramural research, the research we do here on campus and in our federal laboratories, and extramural research, the work that we support in institutions across the United States and around the world. Instead, it's focused on the mission and focus of those two first divisions. And we anticipate that NCATS will provide an interesting experimental ground for looking at how intramural and extramural can work more closely together on achieving shared goals. So our plans are to set up NCATS at the beginning of fiscal year 2012. The federal government fiscal year starts on October 1st, and we're hopeful that we'll actually have an appropriation at that time. Of course, the budget situation has been very uncertain, and sort of dire of late. We have taken a modest budget cut this fiscal year, and we're hoping that next year both that we will get an appropriation and at the beginning of the fiscal year, and that it will include specific appropriations for the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences. So we've transmitted to the Congress information about NCATS, and we will continue to provide additional information both to the Congress and to the patient community and to the private sector as we continue to evolve our plans for creating this exciting new center at the NIH. So that's the conclusion of my presentation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Dr. Hudson, for that interesting and informative presentation. One question that I had for you, I was hoping you could address, is who do you think stands to benefit from this new focus at NIH, and who do you see as your partners in this?
So I think that we all stand to benefit because I think we have all had the circumstance where either we or a family member have been diagnosed with some condition, and where at some point along the way we're told that there's really nothing more to be done, that there's no there's no effective intervention that's available for whatever ails us. And I think the slow pace of new medicines coming onto the market is viewed uniformly as depressing and in need of sort of being bumped up. So I think all of us who want to have healthier, longer lives are going to benefit because of the process improvements that NCATS will generate that can then be adopted by everybody who's interested in therapeutics development. And then in terms of who are our partners, I think that our important partners are going to be the pharmaceutical industry, because we will need them to be able to tell us where we can most usefully focus our efforts. And then also to be able to use them, they will ultimately adopt the process innovations that we develop if they are, in fact, real process innovations. And then, of course, patients and providers will be our partners along the way, as well as the Food and Drug Administration. So I think we have partners in all different sectors who will be important in providing advice and input, working with us to do this process engineering, and then using the products of NCATS research.
Wonderful. Thank you. And if you have time for just one more question,
sure.
I noticed that you had a broad representation from patient organizations in this webinar, and I'm wondering if there are any action steps that these stakeholders can be taking in order to ensure that this effort not only moves forward, but is able to live up to its full potential.
Well, I think we're going to be needing a lot of input as we move forward, particularly as we put together the advisory structure for NCATS. We will need to have nominations of people who are strong leaders who will be able and willing to serve on the advisory council for NCATS. When it gets created, we're going to have to put that together pretty lickety-split as soon as the center is set up. And so that's one important way in which the people who are tuning into this webinar can help. The other is to spread the word about NCATS and make sure that people know what you think about this, and importantly us, to give us feedback on what you think about this new center and its important priorities.
Great, wonderful. Well, we look forward to all of the exciting things that will be coming out of this new initiative. Thank you again for taking the time to speak with us about it today.
You're welcome.